Okay, we are live, and this is the Genius Spark, Reigniting Your Life. It's the book club, and we're on chapter 7, and then we have one more chapter after this. To let everybody know what we're doing with these recordings is we're editing them, cleaning them up, transcribing them, creating content like an article, discussion questions if you have your own book club, and a quiz. If you're part of our certification process, this will be part of your learning, and there's a quiz to make sure you've gone through and you've mastered the materials. The exciting thing is that you can have your own book club for your company or your team and do it at your pace, and you'll have everything you need to do that, except you'll want to buy copies of the book. Chapter 7 is igniting the potential, and this gets more practical into how does the tool, the process, the whole model that we've developed, how do you put it into action? The goal is to make it simple enough that once you go through the fundamentals, and the fundamentals include building your genius paragraph and your kryptonite paragraph, you've got 80% of what you need to do this on your own. I'll tell you why this is so critical for organizations to have the ability to do this, to not have to rely on an outside coach or expert or trainer to do this. This is where all the systems fall down. And this is the main problem we were trying to solve, make it simple enough. And we'll share with you what that simplicity is and why we believe this is the game changer. To start out, what I'd like to do is go to the end of the chapter and give you the highlights of what we're going to do. So I'm going to be reading from the text. One of the values of this is that when companies invest in assessments and training, most of it is for the leadership and the management of the company, so it seldom goes all the way down into the organization. And here's an opportunity for this to go through the whole organization. I've got a great story of a distributor, one of my favorite clients. They've got a little over 2,000 employees, and close to half of those employees either work in the warehouse or delivery. They've never had a program that they could take throughout the whole organization until this one, and it's a game changer. In this age of really considering, are we providing everybody comparable opportunities, then this is a great tool and a process for that. And it keeps the cost low and it makes it easy to do. Those are the two key criteria. Number 2, the big thing it does is it transfers ownership for self-awareness, self-assessment, and growth to the employee, not the manager. We change that vital relationship from boss to coach and putting more of ownership, which also improves and increases engagement to the employee. Reducing the conflict through feedback. We've got some tools that allow you to give feedback to me on what I look like at my best and how did I show up and what gets in my way and is it getting in your way, and have an easy bridge so these things don't build up and become major sources of conflict. It also will help managers and organizations optimize talent. Do we have the right people in the right seat on the bus? And is the person able to see how my strengths apply in this context and how the manager can help them apply it to this context? When I went through my midlife course correction with the dot-com crash, and I was essentially fired from my role as a VP of sales, but given the opportunity, I say given the opportunity, to go into straight commission sales, I had to go back and move from leadership and management into selling again. And I had sold in the past, but it'd been 20 years since I was actively doing it. Knowing how I sell accelerated my getting back into the game, so to speak. And by the end of that period, I was the highest salesperson almost by 10x. I finished my last year in that sales role before I went off to do speaking, consulting, coaching, and all of that, with $24.5 million of revenue in office furniture and what we call architectural solutions. And the norm for the rest of the sales team was under 3 million. We had a couple in the $5 million range, but in general, it was 2 to 3 million on average. I attribute that to my ability of knowing the way I sell best versus just going out and doing it the way everybody else does. Develop managerial skills. We'll talk about why this is either the linchpin of an organization or the Achilles heel. Getting the managers involved in these human skills and knowing how to do it simply is the game changer. And then developing that ability to build more trust and understanding, building trust by people knowing how I'm wired, that genuineness, transparency on my genius and my kryptonite, and my understanding people better. This is important because, as I've shared in the past, empathy for me is number 34. It's the bottom. And I joke, and it's true, but my family says that Dad wants to care. He just doesn't. But when I know how somebody's wired, what they do best, what it looks like, and how their strengths get in their way, I may not have that instinctive ability to put myself in someone else's shoes, but I certainly have the insight. And so there's several ways you can get to that EQ, that emotional intelligence. And you either can have it instinctively, and they say about 18% of people have that instinctive emotional intelligence, but it can be learned. And we have a process we think accelerates that learning curve. And then our program is continuing to evolve, add tools, gain understanding, gather stories of success. So we're in this continual evolution phase. And you'll find that most companies in this sector, they have their, quote, slide deck. And instead of being innovative and adapting, what most of them do is take their storehouse of information, they just slice it up into different permutations. One of the companies that we've worked a lot with, they've got a managerial version. It's basically a slight variation on their standard training on personal development. And then they've got a teacher's version. It's, again, a variation, and they're not really tailored and customized. But that's what we do. We do that tailoring and customizing. So in working with organizations and having looked at over 19,000 profiles and probably a couple thousand organizations or at least teams, here's some things that people are looking for. When they hire a company to come in and do assessments, one of their goals in the training is to create a common language. We're all dolphins or German Shepherds, or I'm an ENTJ, or I'm an Enneagram 3. That's shorthand, and it's part of a common language. One of the changes that we've done, we want to make that common language common. We don't want clever names that have to be memorized and remember what an ENTJ is, an IPJ, what the difference is. People can't remember that. What they can remember is your paragraph, how you describe yourself and the stories behind that paragraph. And this is my stories. Think of that paragraph as an elevator speech tailored to you, and I can remember those. And we do have other shorthand archetypes, patterns. Think of a deck of cards. If you work with a deck of cards, if you play poker, you know what a full house is, you know what a flush is, you know what two of a kind. So when you've got the strengths in a 4 quadrant system, and most of the systems have some kind of quadrant basis, whether it's DISC or Myers-Briggs, even Gallup, Core Clarity. They all have some kind of bucket system, categories that they work with. And we do too, because it gives us shorthand that then allows us to go deeper. Having a simple process to tap into hidden potential. Every organization wants to help people find their sweet spot, tap into that hidden potential. The challenge most organizations have is you get insight, but then it doesn't really release that potential. And I could go into challenges that managers have and knowing how to use the tools and tap into that, and challenges the individual has and how to tailor what they see that potential is in their context. When we have this common denominator of this is what I look like at my best, here's this little elevator pitch or paragraph, now we can talk about how did it show up and how can I help you with this. And it creates a common language and it breaks it down into the easiest part, which is a picture of who I am. How to perform under pressure. This is where a lot of people have challenges, and this is where conflict oftentimes arises. So we want to help people know how to be self-aware, self-manage, or self-regulate. One of the areas that I've learned a lot from is a school in Oak Cliff, Texas. It's south of Dallas, and it has historically been a at-risk community. And there is a lab school built from a family counseling therapy center that's been there for 100 years. And they decided to put into practice what they were learning about self-regulation, the autonomic nervous system. And they start with 3-year-olds up to 5th grade. They teach these kids how to know when they're agitated, when their prefrontal cortex is shutting down, how to breathe to self-regulate. You can go to YouTube and see some of their demonstrations of this, and this stays with kids for life, this ability to self-regulate. We want to be able to build similar kind of self-awareness. Here's how I show up at my best. Here's what it looks like when I get in my way. Here's what it looks like under pressure. And here's what it looks like when I'm in my strengths, but not aware of how it feels like on the other side of you. One of the biggest challenges is how do we get employees engaged? And I'll go through some of those numbers. You probably know those numbers if you followed along. But that's the biggest gap, or the chasm, is managers' ability to tap into the intrinsic elements of motivation of their people, not extrinsic, which is punishment, reward type of thing. Intrinsic, it releases motivation that I love doing it for the sake of doing it. We want to help managers get there simply, intuitively, and be able to release that in people. And then another huge challenge is scale this. How do we scale this through an organization? And again, if you talk to any organization that has gone through the training, we run into this challenge too because of the mindset of organizations who invest in some of this training. It's typically a one and done, and it doesn't go below the upper managers or even mid-level managers in an organization. So it doesn't scale, it doesn't affect the culture. And the tools die off after a while because there's maybe a few experts in HR, and maybe once a quarter you bring in a coach to remember what we did. But it doesn't get embedded in the daily practice. We've made it simple enough that you don't have to be an expert in the system. According to Forbes magazine, and looking at, companies will spend $500 to $1,000 a year per employee for development training that never gets utilized. If we know just in a random group of people, and this is what success motivation people count on and get a stadium of 1,000 people. Out of that 1,000, if they get 50 people that actually become the fans and the advocates, it's enough for them. And then they get another 10% who stay interested for a while. But we can't afford to do that in a company. We need engagement through the whole organization. This gets to the problem of there's just too much stuff, noise, content in the training. And I know it looks impressive when everybody's got a huge binder and lots of workbooks and we're flipping through pages and filling things out. I know that looks great, but again, that kind of learning was obsolete back in the 1960s. It's part of the problem we have with our traditional education system. We're still learning through workbooks and lecture and tests and memorization. And in 1955, a book came out called Why Johnny Can't Read. It was getting into the challenge of moving into a different kind of world, moving out of industrial service economy into information economy. And so the learning curve and the consumption of information and putting it into practice changes completely. And what we're doing and what we're helping is moving through keeping the content side to a minimum so you can get into the practice side more quickly and going from the aha, the discovery, into understanding. And you don't need to understand a whole system. And that's part of the problem, is that every approach, you've got to learn a whole system. And if it's Gallup, there's 34 strengths, 33,600,000 combinations, and trying to learn all of them and know that Jimmy's got achiever and Sally's got winning others over. After a while, it just becomes too much, and it's all cognitive. It can be DISC, which is a simpler system, but still, I'm a high D, second I, S and C, but even within the DISC system, you've got a range of what high D can mean and a range of what I can mean. And so there's almost an infinite variety of where those can be. Even if you're well trained, it takes a long time to learn how to tell the difference between two people who may have D as their dominant, I as their secondary, S as their third, C. Same thing with Myers-Briggs. I'm an ENTJ in Myers-Briggs. And I can put 4 or 5 people together that are ENTJs. They'll all be extremely different. Now, E stands for extrovert. But I am not an extrovert. Extrovert means technically where you get your energy from. If you look at my Clifton strengths, you'll see that 4 of my 5 Clifton strengths are thinking and doing. Those are all energy from inside of me, not relationally. The Myers-Briggs is so generic, and it's probably the least accurate of the systems out there. It's useful from this standpoint is that it's common. People know it. Again, going back to we want a common language, there's great value to that. The real value is the conversation of getting to know people through a framework. Then the learning model of learning and workbooks that gets you from discovery, we call it the aha, to understanding. Now I know what relator means, but even there again, when I'm reading relator, it's a range. It's called a theme. What it specifically means to me depends on where it is in the ranking, either the top 1 or number 5, and what it's next to. Someone who is relator strategic is very different from someone who is relator analytical in terms of how they show up. So how do you tailor that so you have a cohesive picture of what this combination looks like? That's part of what our software does. And we synthesize that in a paragraph that describes you at your best. And then there's what we call this knowing-doing gap. Jeffrey Pfeffer wrote a great book on the knowing-doing gap. And again, he's busting this whole model of MBA training and professional training of we learn all this stuff, but it seldom translates into transformation or embedded practical daily application. And that's another one of the challenges that we've solved in connecting you with the protocol of the practice of rewiring the brain. That's the sports science of reinforcing who you are at your best, imagining or simulating or rehearsing or visualizing how you're going to show up today at your best, then getting feedback from others, and then at the end reflecting on how did I show up at my best. That's called the bookend days protocol. And then the ladder of learning, the discovery, the understanding, connecting it to experience, and then going all the way up the ladder. And eventually to mastery, and then from beginning to go into virtue, where you start seeing that relator, for example, for me, at its best is a genuine friend. Now, masterful relating, if I'm in mastery mode, then I'm genuine, I'm open, transparent. I sense whether reciprocating in that, and in that reciprocal dynamic, building deeper relationship, that's the mastery. But there's another level, and that's the virtue side of things. The challenge of understanding others. So you're an INFP. I am an ENTJ. Well, what does that mean? How do I connect and relate to you better? Now, if I know what you look like, your portrait, your paragraph, then I can now understand, oh, I love doing this. I get engaged doing that. I'm the go-to person for this. Now that's tangible and that makes sense for me. And then the process of bridging those differences. In the learning the system, we've already talked about that there's 33,600,000 different combinations of the top 5. Some systems, ours included, break those top 5 into 4 zones, which then creates like a deck of cards. We can make sense if we've got 52 cards and there's 4 suits and we've got a range. Similar concept. One of the zones are the relating strengths. We help you understand what makes them distinct and powerful is that they pick up on nonverbal cues that make relationships work. Genuineness, reliability, someone who is on the margins and needs to be brought in, how someone's doing today, whether the team is aligned or not, genuineness or not, how to tailor how I talk to you and individualize it, talent or not. That's the range. Now, I just went through 8 or so of those relating strengths in terms of what that nonverbal instinct is all about. And we signify those with blue. Then there are the motivating strengths. And again, they're instinctive in real time around someone's potential and how they're either tapping or not tapping into that. Either lack of confidence, lack of direction, lack of motivation, whatever it is. And depending on the strength that we have, then our response is aimed at making that strength come alive or making that talent come alive. And it could be through persuasion, encouragement, setting a high standard, challenging someone, directness, nurturing and encouraging along the way. Several different ways instinctively doing that. Then there are what we call the thinking strengths. And the thinking strengths can be high-level thinking, fast thinking, forward thinking, historical thinking, deep dive thinking, nonlinear, creative, a whole range. And they're internal to me. And then the acting strengths, the orange acting, roughly they break into 3 categories: those that get things started, those that keep them going, and those that finish them. So with that system, and once you've dropped your 5 strengths into 4 zones, there's 15 different patterns. So again, you've got some shorthand and you can learn some interesting insight. They don't tell us everything about a person, but they can tell us where they're more fluent. So we call zones language zone. I've got 3 thinking strengths. So thinking, it comes naturally, and it's where I get my energy from. I love thinking, creating, planning, preparing, solving problems, all of that. When we boil it all down, what we're looking at are a couple of essentials. What do we really want out of all this work, learning, and systems? First, I want a clear, concise, compelling picture of what I look like at my best. That's what I want. I also want to know how I can get in my way. And again, our approach is focusing on how strengths can sometimes hinder me in being as effective as I can. And it typically happens either under stress, where I push my strengths too hard, or a lack of self-awareness of what it feels like on the other side of me. Those are the 2 basic ways that my strengths can hinder me. I do have gaps like empathy, but the lack of empathy in terms of being strong seldom gets in my way. And focusing on my strengths, my top 5, to compensate for that is a more effective strategy, according to Gallup's research, than trying to elevate empathy. And the reason is that it's a brain wiring thing. You've got these dense synaptic clusters and strong neurons that are giving signals, fast signals. And building on that, because they're already strong and clustered and networked together, yields more results than trying to get some lonely neuron way down here that's not connected to anything in particular to somehow move up the ranks. And that's why focusing on weaknesses, which has been part of management practice for 70 years or more, it's futile to get me to, quote, be able to instinctively put myself in someone else's shoes. Using my top 5, I can use learner, my curiosity strength, relator, my genuineness strength, to be interested in someone and to learn about what it's like for them, get inside their world, not instinctively, but think of it like if I had empathy, it would be like a first language and I would instinctively be able to put myself in someone else's shoes. But I can very effectively have a second language of my learner relator and get there not instinctively, not naturally, but effectively. So that's the model of helping someone develop and bridge an area that they may have a gap in. What I look like at my best, how do I reinforce that? That's another part of the process. And we use sports science here, so we've got some previous chapters that go into that. I alluded to it earlier in terms of the reinforcing. I read my Genius paragraph this morning. I asked, how am I going to show up at my best, for example, at the LinkedIn Live with one of my clients. I've got a workshop this afternoon. I don't do anything more than that, just give the question, how am I going to show up at my best? When I have opportunity, I'll give somebody we have a worksheet that has my 5 strengths and all the choices in terms of the 8 different options or traits that can describe my strategic at its best and the 4 traits that show how it can get in my way. And I'll ask for people, hey, you work with me a lot. If you were to build a paragraph of what I look like at my best, which traits would you pick? And when you watch and notice how I get in my way, what traits would you pick? And I'd like to hear what you picked and why. The final part of it is in the evening when I look for tying the day. How did I show up is basically the question. And I'll pick those times where I was engaged, it was motivating, I felt highly productive. I did a workshop for interns Monday, and these are juniors in college getting ready to go in the workplace. One of my clients has this incredible intern program where all the interns get a personal coach. A couple times a week, they bring in an outside expert on a topic like presentation skills or resume. Mine was, of course, on finding your sweet spot, how to master yourself, finding your genius. And it was awesome. For almost all of them, they've never experienced anything like this. The accuracy of the results just blew their minds. The fun we had creating movie characters, it was just all cylinders, high engagement. In that state, the endorphin state, serotonin connecting with people. So at the end of the day, I highlighted that. I said that was my highlight for the day. And I just went through and tied it to my different strengths. What that does is it's called closed loop learning. It's what engages neuroplasticity, and that's the brain adapting and shifting and becoming more trained like an athlete does. Think of it as reps in a batting cage, or for me, tennis, hitting forehand after forehand. It's building that memory. The brain is storing that, so it's becoming more instinctive, more natural, more in real time, and able to anticipate what's coming. That's the process of insight to transformation. And then the other part of it is, how do I bridge with somebody who's different than me? That's the simple process. Knowing what I look like at my best, knowing how I get my way, having a simple process of reinforcing, simulating, feedback, reflection, and then getting to understand others better to bridge that. We've gone through this in a previous chapter. Whatever assessment you have, you can do the same thing. We just happen to have a software that helps you do it with the Clifton Strengths. In the future, we'll have other assessments that, if you've taken it, helps you take you to trait sentences that you can build into a customized paragraph on who you are. But it all starts with the paragraph, whether you do it manually through another system or you do it through our software, then tying your paragraph to stories and examples of what this looks like in real life. And of course, we talked about getting the feedback side of things. How does this work and go from insight into transformation? This is where we tap into sports science and how athletes program themselves. And I'll use Michael Phelps as an example. If you go into YouTube or if you read some articles, he walks through his process of mental training for competition. And he starts with a goal. I want to win the 200 butterfly. So that's the wish. The outcome is, in order to win the 200 butterfly, I have to swim it in this time. And then what could go wrong? And I've used the example of the China Olympics where he won 8 gold medals. In the 4th and 7th race, his goggles filled up with water. That's one thing that could go wrong. And if it happened to you and I, we would be blind and we'd be struggling. What he did, his planning, is he simulated, if I do this, I click immediately into counting my strokes. And so that was his handling obstacles. That was the plan, and that's the final piece. It's a methodology developed by Harvard psychologist Gabrielle Oettingen on high performance, and it's WOOP. Wish, outcome, obstacle, plan. I don't do anything near that elaborate. If I'm doing high stakes things like a keynote, I will walk through and primarily rehearse my opening and my ending, because for me, getting those two things down, then everything flows in between. Think of my paragraph as my wish. So my wish is that I show up at my best, and here's that description of what it looks like. The outcome I want is to give a compelling LinkedIn Live on Chapter 7. The obstacle is I may forget some things. I go through the chapter and create note cards for each item. And then that's my plan to get through. Now, if I'm having a workshop with somebody, I read my paragraph in the morning once. And then I've got a workshop with Alexis this afternoon. I will simply ask my question, and I know what I'm doing is I'm unpacking her 34 strengths. And I'll ask myself, okay, so how do I want to show up at my best with Alexis? That's it. We know that the brain behind the scenes is working to answer the problem. Just like when you get stuck trying to solve a problem, you let it go and you come back later and boom, your brain is still working on it. Again, this is performance science. The reason why mentally simulating it is important and it works and it saves you from having to go out and physically swim. It doesn't mean you don't do that, but this helps reinforce and accelerate when they take athletes and musicians, put them in an fMRI, brain scan, and have them go through their routine mentally. It's firing the same parts of the brain. That's why this is so vital when you go through a workshop. If you don't have a way of practicing, then you lose it. And that's why all these programs die, because you have no ability to practice. And all it takes is a little bit consistently. This is from Darren Hardy's book, Compound Gains. A little bit consistently. It takes me 30, 45 seconds max in the morning, read my paragraph, look at my calendar, ask, now how am I going to show up at my best in this LinkedIn Live? How am I going to show up at my best with Alexi? Then I let it go. At the end of the day, all of that's good, but I don't kick in the neuroplasticity, locking it in, unless I review at night those highlight moments, and then connect it back and tell the brain, oh, this was relator at its best. This was achiever, getting it done, and it felt good. And going through that little bit. Now, this is a 3 to 5 minute reflection, reminding, going back, connecting it. And I actually write it down at night. That's the routine. That goes from knowledge to transformation. In other words, from knowing to doing and being able to do it well. What we want to also create in an organization is what we call a feedback culture. This is one of the most challenging things we have, is how do we give, quote, constructive feedback? Someone, quote, gave me constructive feedback a week or so ago. It didn't feel all that constructive for me. But what we have is a template that's got your strengths and all the traits that you filled out in the software, but now it's just, you see a checklist of the 8 traits for each of your strengths and the 4 traits of your kryptonite. You can give it to anybody and ask them, fill this out and pick the traits, not just one, but pick the traits you think capture me at my best and how I get in my way, and I'd like to grab coffee with you. Hear what you selected and why. That's the important part, the and why. The first round, to get used to it, we say go to friends and family, people who know you well and will enjoy this exercise. And the real value, again, is the conversation that it ignites and it spurs and the curiosity. Then the next level is peer-to-peer, where peers are sharing their user trait worksheet with one another, filling out their version of each other. But now when I come, I will read first. I'll say, Joe, here's my genius paragraph and why I picked it. Here's some examples. And we call this share and compare. So I shared. Now, Joe will compare. Rex, here's what I picked. And it could be he picked some of the same, he picked different. But the key is and why. And here's what I see. I picked the same one you did, but here's some examples and how I see it in action. So vital to get that feedback. Then you can do employee boss, back and forth. We've had a manager in a live meeting and everyone filled it out and came in with their version, and they just went through and heard what each person said about the manager. Think of that as a live 360. But we've also had the manager give their version of what they see someone at their best, and not only as a baseline, but also as a review process. I just finished this project. We made a presentation for a proposal to a prospect, and I got to sit in and watch. So the person will come and I say, okay, Mary, share with me how you played to your strengths. What strengths came alive in that putting it together in that presentation? And I've got my version too. So I will build on it and I will help solidify it for them. And then where would you like to improve? Which ones would you like to improve and how can I help you improve that? Now we get to the kryptonite side. And I will ask, Mary, where do you think in this process some of your strengths got in the way? Now again, this will take some time, training, comfort level, psychological safety, all of that. It's not as big a hurdle as people originally imagined. It's actually pretty easy. But just recognize the first time or two, someone may just easy their way in. And then you'll compare what you heard or what you saw and have them reflect on it, on how do you want to manage this and reduce the impact of this going forward. One of my kryptonites under pressure is with a strategic and achiever is I get extremely focused. When I've got a short amount of time, any kind of interruption in my flow of getting things done, I react. That can look like anger or reactiveness. And that intensity, if I come into the house and I'm still in that pressure, got to get things done mode, my wife will see that and ask me to take a walk around the house once or twice until I can shift gears. That feedback is essential, even feedback from your kids. I did that a few years ago at Christmas with my kids, asking them to give dad feedback on what he looks like at his best and not. And I learned something new that I hadn't heard from anybody else's feedback, and all three of them picked the same one. And it was gold to hear that and reflect on what is the nature of my relationship with them, where all three of them experienced this trait of mine as getting in the way or hindering our relationship. Then when there's friction between people, we have a process of bridging the differences. As we said, performance reviews. And we've even used it in performance improvement processes, and it's been quite effective. One of the biggest benefits of the innovation that we've developed is it enables managers to be effective. And it may be the only tool that does it so simply. Managers are either the linchpin or the Achilles heel. And what Gallup says, only 18% are instinctive, intuitive, natural around what we call the human skills or the soft skills. 82% are more what we call task-oriented managers. I was with an executive yesterday, total task orientation, and I asked him, do people find you intimidating, hard to work for? And he said, I'm very demanding. We've got more work to do there. But that was simply, I don't factor in any human elements. You either get it done or you don't. You either keep your commitments and you don't. And you're either up to doing the job or you're not. That is the state of most managers, is get it done and things are good. Don't get it done, things are bad. But I'm not here to help you figure it out. 70% of engagement in employees is directly related to the manager. And it's not a coincidence that 70% of employees say that they'd rather be any place else than work. 50% going through the motions, checked out, 20% creating damage. So how do we enable those 82%? Again, we've talked through the major lift is having everybody create their paragraphs, and it's very easy to do. Once we have those paragraphs, it's very simple for a manager to shift the role, and instead of giving the critique, ask the employee, hey, on that last project, share with me how you showed up at your best. What part of your traits did you tap into? And with a little practice, it becomes second nature, And now they're taking the ownership of self-awareness, self-assessment, and growth on their own. And now my role is simply facilitating, guiding, coaching along the process. It's a huge shift in the dynamic between the manager and the employee. That shift in the nature of going from, quote, boss to facilitator, guide, coach is the difference that makes the difference and shifts the organization to what we call a strengths-based culture. Imagine if every employee came in and thought about and was practiced, because you're doing it consistently week after week. So in that presentation, where did you show up at your best? What did that look like? Where did that come from in you? What would you like to improve? Where do you think you got in your way? And what did that look like? And how would you manage that? That's it. That's all a manager has to do. They don't have to learn a system, because the heavy lifting work has already been done by the employee in building their paragraph. Now, let's talk about the other big challenge. How do we scale this? I'm going to share one story, and I was with the interns of that company this week. About 2,000, they're about 2,000 in workforce. Half of that approximately is warehouse and delivery. We did a workshop, brought people into the workshop from the executive level all the way down to supervisors in the warehouse and delivery. And all went through it. They had never received anything like this. I had several of the people that are in delivery in the warehouse come up to me and say, wow, we've never gone through anything like this. This is so insightful. I want to use it with my family. And of course, we encourage that and we help people do it with their family. But the EVP came back to me and said, you know what? This is the first time we've ever done anything like this where we could bring everybody in and it was a level playing field. My managers loved it. We feel like this is easy to do, and that was great. We just completed a year process of an enterprise-wide rollout for a company. And I went to, quote, the graduation in June in Chicago, and the managers are using it and they're coming up with ways to adapt the tools. And that's what you love to see, that they have the ownership. They're not depending on us. Now we've got the tools. We've got a whole online learning management platforms, and we've got a forum every Thursday from 11 to 12 Central Standard Time for anybody who's gone through our training to come for free and continue to learn. Now, part of the challenge is how do we take this enterprise-wide but also create a culture? And some of the work I do is around developing culture, and this is not directly related to Genius Spark, but I wanted to share with you some of the key elements of how you build culture. And first of all, it's what you say or the vision you cast. What's important to you and how you repeat that and reinforce that. Number two, what you do. Do you walk that talk? Are you consistently or congruent with the vision, the values, the attitudes, the habits and behaviors that you tell people this is who we are at our best and this is what we want to aspire to? Are you consistently recognizing people who are behaving and contributing aligned with what you say is important and how you live is important? What we measure. Do you have a team health or an organizational health dashboard with 3 to 5 key leading indicators? Are we consistently doing what we say is important to us? Are we training people consistently, reinforcing? Are we funding this effort? The thing that has the most impact on culture is what do you tolerate? We've got a way of helping organizations build the behaviors they need. And we use a boat metaphor, and it's built on Gallup's 3 people or 30% in the front of the boat. There's 5 people in the middle of the boat that are happy because they're going along for the ride, but they'll do a good job if you tell them what to do, tell them how to do it, and follow up and make sure they did it. Then you've got 2 in the back of the boat drilling a hole. One of the ways we help teams with the system is we do have an aggregate of the team's strengths and what the team looks like at its best. So that's number one. We can build a picture of what we look like at our best and build a picture of how we get in our way, our kryptonite. But then once that's done, we want to know what those behaviors are that contribute to that. We've got a couple different ways of going back, but what we want are real behaviors that are happening in the organizations, not things you go away and think. We want people to be honest. What does that mean? These are traits that are embedded, part of your organic culture now that reflect you at your best. So we got the paragraph of what we look like at our best. Now we're finding those behaviors and call it ethnographic research. You're going out seeing in the wild what these look like at their best. And we call these celebrated behaviors, tolerated behaviors, and then the behaviors we have to weed out. When you develop it as a team, you've got the team setting norms and being able to hold each other accountable. And the challenge that we found is when there's somebody who's outside the norm without having this common understanding, it's very hard for a manager to pull someone in and say they're late consistently. And this is a real case. And you've got a manager with strengths and talents that are more empathetic, relational, non-confrontational. That's a recipe for nothing happen and the manager feeling pressure and the other person just doing what they do. We had the team go through what are the celebrated behaviors, tolerated behaviors, and one of the behaviors that was not tolerated is coming in late. That's rude, it's entitled, disrespectful, that's what the team said, and not being prepared. It takes a huge weight off the manager to have to manage that. And they're able to now turn to the team. How do you feel about this? How do we want to deal with this? So now it's shifting the burden. Again, we want to shift the burden away from managers carrying all the weight, being the hall room monitor, the bosses, into being guides and facilitators. Now they're facilitating this team discussion. Thank you for spending time with us. And what I like you to remember, and one of my catchphrases is, let's all aspire to be wonderfully weird. Take care.